This event is sponsored by SPJ New England and the National Programming Committee. Thank you everyone for joining. I just wanted to introduce John Ryan. It's a pleasure to have him speak with us today. He is the best to make introductions. So without further ado, John, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thanks to the Society of Professional Journalists for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, as I think one of the themes of my Guantanamo experience is that many people don't know what's going on there or haven't followed it in a long period of time. So I'm really, happy to take advantage of any opportunity to talk about what's been going on there. So I'm the co-founder of a company called Lawdragon, which is a legal media company. We're known probably best for our guides to leading lawyers and profiling lawyers. And that's actually how I got um, into the Guantanamo story. I was going down to Guantanamo as part of a profile that I was writing of a lawyer named David Nevin, who was the lead lawyer for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the five Guantanamo Bay detainees charged with planning the 9/11 attacks. And so I had interviewed him in early 2015, and then later that year I went down to Guantanamo to kind of see him in action. And there were so few journalists covering the case. There were just a few there with me that I decided to write a few stories about what was going on in the case and not do the profile just yet. And then I went back again in 2015 for a second hearing. Again, very few journalists. And then I was sort of hooked and kept going back. And so, some 60 trips and 11 years later, I've probably spent about one third of my life on Guantanamo Bay. A little bit less in recent years, but some of the case has been on appeal in some issues, but I've spent a huge amount of time going. I think, for any journalists out there, I think one of the things that has made my situation unique is that co-running and I helped start Lawdragon, and then I've co-run it. I think that that allowed me to have the freedom to go when I wanted to. So for a lot of the trips, it's really just me and the New York Times reporter, who's Carol Rosenberg. Sometimes we're the only two journalists on the trip. So you've got one of the biggest and best resourced news organizations in the world, and then a smaller niche publication like myself, made possible just by the fact that I can sort of, assign myself to go. And my business partner, who edits all my stories, Katrina Dewey, she's supportive of that. And so we've been able to stick with it when really most other media outlets have gone away. And that's kind of the how I got into it. And then I can, at least if you think it's good, I can sort of go into like what's been going on there.
Oh,
Uh,
100%. Yes, please.
yeah. So, the biggest question that people have is sort of why, we're looking at the 25th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and the case is still in pretrial proceedings. There's actually not a trial date set at this point. They've been arguing over, a huge number of pretrial issues. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Just a little bit of background is that, you know, President Bush, his administration established this corridor. It was established by Congress during the Bush administration, and they were initially charged in 2008. Then President Obama wanted to move it. His attorney general wanted to move it to federal court in Manhattan. That never happened. But then the court was sort of reformed, and then the defendants were charged again in May 2012. So there was a little bit of delay there. But since that time, we're still now, 14 years after that and still no trial. A lot of it is the fact that it's a new court. There are a lot of matters of first impression, or sort of a lot of issues that are litigated for the first time as they're figuring stuff out. But the the biggest issue, which is what I write about, probably most of my articles have been about this in recent years, and it's the subject of the book that I've done, which is that the five defendants prior to arriving on Guantanamo Bay in 2006, during the Bush administration, they had been held by the Central Intelligence Agency at overseas black sites, And it was at those sites that they were tortured and held in isolation and sort of repeatedly questioned in order to get intelligence from them. So when the case began, and as it's moved forward, that's been the biggest issue in the case. It's a lot of it is tied in some way to the torture. And what it comes down to is that the government, the prosecution team, has acknowledged that it cannot use anything the defendants said when they were being held by the CIA at the black sites because that would be inadmissible. They admit that. But their position is that when they got to Guantanamo Bay, they were questioned again by the FBI in sort of traditional, what they call rapport building, rapport style interviews, and the defendants admitted to their roles in the attacks in those sessions. And so the government wants to use that at trial. The defense teams believe that those statements are all tainted by the torture that came before it, the torture and the isolation, that they were conditioned into saying whatever government agents wanted, whether it was the CIA at the black sites or the FBI in Guantanamo Bay. So that issue has been really the dominant issue in the case. They spent years arguing over what evidence and witnesses the defense teams would have access to in presenting this argument that the confession should be suppressed. And then they started the suppression hearing in 2019. So even that 7 years ago, there was a delay caused by the pandemic. The base was shut down for about a year and a half. But really, the case has still been really preoccupied with this one issue. And it gets even a little bit more confusing in that about 80% of the way into this hearing, this sort of epic hearing that just on this one motion is bigger than almost any trial in U.S. history. About 80% of the way into that, the main defendant, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and two other co-defendants reached a plea deal with the government. So they were wanting to plead guilty in exchange for having the death penalty be taken off the table. So they would admit to their roles in the attacks, and then they would not be executed, and there would be a sentencing trial in which a lot of evidence against them would be aired. But the Secretary of Defense at the time, this is in the summer of 2024, Lloyd Austin, he withdrew from the agreement. So he sort of overruled the prosecution team and the court official who kind of oversees the court. So he withdrew, saying that he felt there should be a trial. So for really a year and a half or so, those three defense teams have litigated for their right to plead guilty. They've been trying to plead guilty, and the matter is now at the Supreme Court. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're petitioning for the Supreme Court to force the government to adhere to these plea agreements. They had won at the trial court level, but the D.C. Court of Appeals, which is the appellate court that oversees the Guantanamo court system, has sided with the government, saying that Lloyd Austin could legally withdraw from the plea deal. So, but while that was going on, one of the defendants who did not want to plead guilty, he moved forward with his suppression hearing, and he prevailed. So, the the prior judge in the 9/11 case earlier has ruled last year that his confessions will be suppressed because of his past torture and because of his mistreatment and isolation by the CIA. So that defendant has prevailed on the most important pretrial issues so far. And now the other three teams are sort of forced to make a similar argument, and the judge will rule on their suppression motions this summer. So far that, the judge, there's a new judge on the case who will be making this ruling, but it's also important to note that in a different military commission, sort of a separate case on Guantanamo Bay involving the defendant who's accused of planning the USS Cole bombing, which took place in October 2000 off the coast of Yemen, that judge also suppressed his confessions based on the CIA torture that came before. So you have two judges in the court system who have ruled that the torture that happened prior to their arrival in Guantanamo Bay has sort of, stained anything that happened after it in terms of statements they made to law enforcement agents. So when the judge in the 9/11 case now will rule on the remaining suppression motions, and then possibly after that, they would move on to kind of final motions before a trial would start. The government believes a trial can start next year. The defense teams generally think that that's not realistic. So that is a lot. That's, that's a quick version of 11 years, but um, we did the book last year as opposed to waiting for the trial because I think I was lucky to find a publisher and an editor who really believed that what's happened in the past 10 years, what's happened in the pretrial phase is really, really important, and you can't just wait for the trial if it happens. Because what's happened, sort of why, the title of the book is America's Trial, and there hasn't been a trial, but the idea is that America's sort of been fighting itself in court. On the one hand, you had the government that was willing to remove people from the law and hold them in complete secrecy in really brutal conditions for years. The context is important in that that was done. Their stated reason for doing that was to gather intelligence to prevent an attack that might be worse than 9/11. That was the fear at the time when when they were apprehended. But they were removed from the law. They were tortured. They were held in complete isolation. And the government was willing to do that, but then it brings them into a court of law and sort of goes through this entire process to try to have a fair as possible process. The defense teams would criticize that notion that it's fair, but the government still spend all this money to try to fit these people into a court of law, despite of what happened before. So I refer to that as in the book as America's split personality. That there's these two sides of America that are playing out in court, and it hasn't really worked out in that if it if it was possible, then we would have had a trial by now. And as I said earlier, 25 years after the attacks, there's still not a trial date on the calendar. Um, so I can definitely and one thing I'll say is that I talked about this being kind of a unique experience of spending so much time um, on Guantanamo Bay. The book is written in first person kind of from my perspective, from researching before going on the first trip in 2015 through all the trips that have happened since. And the reason I did that was and it was in discussion with the editor of the book to make it as readable as possible because the case has been so confusing. But in my journalism career over also, which is about 25 years, I've used the I voice in writing, less than a handful of times, and yet this entire book is done that way to sort of bring the reader in. So the point of the book is sort of bring the reader on this journey with me and see kind of the madness unfold, as it happens. So I'm happy to stop there at least and take questions or go a little bit farther.
Yeah,
But
actually, that was really a good assessment, and I appreciate your, unbiased reporting. I do want to tap into, since nobody really has the opportunity or access to go to Gitmo, if you could kind of talk about what happens when journalists go there, and what the sounds, the sights, what you're feeling, what happens in terms of going on to the military base, just to kind of get a behind the scenes scenario from you.
yeah, absolutely. So whether the Guantanamo court is a public court, whether the proceedings are public, is really in the eye of the beholder. I think defense teams and other people who have been critical of the military commissions really view it as not a public proceeding, that it was designed to sort of hide a lot of what's happened in the past and put it on a remote base where very few people can see what's happening. But um, the Pentagon does put out advisories, media advisories to alert people that hearings are coming up, and then media can apply to attend, which is what I did for the first time in 2015. So you fill out a form, and then they'll do a background check, and then as the hearing gets closer, you're informed of sort of the travel schedule and if you can still make it. But it's a lot, it's a lot of effort involved in the trip. It's an entire Pentagon operation, so I think that's being clear. But this isn't a federal court as part of the judiciary. It was established by Congress as a military court in the Department of Defense. So it's run by the military. So everybody who attends the proceedings goes to Joint Base Andrews for the flights there. And almost no one who works for the court lives on the base. There's really no reason for that. So everybody's stateside, and then everybody convenes at Joint Base Andrews the day of the flight, and that includes the judges, prosecutors, defense teams, victim family members, the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations who can go in, and the media. So we all assemble at Joint Base Andrews. We take the same flight, and then we're on the small ecosystem of the base together. It's a very claustrophobic setting. It's really unusual for reporting. You sort of see you'll be in court with people, and then you'll see them at the bar later that night or at the gym or what have you. So it's really unusual in that sense. For years, media stayed intense in the Camp Justice area, which is the same complex that houses the court system and kind of related buildings. So we were intense until the pandemic. During the pandemic, when the base was shut down, the tents were not maintained. And so starting when the base opened back up in the summer of 2021, we stayed in the hotel. So the base has three hotels, and we stay in one of them now, which is a huge improvement in quality of life. It's more expensive. The tents were free. The hotels are, $90 a night or whatever, but it's been a big improvement. The base is really a small town. It's really like a small Caribbean beach town. It's very quiet. There's very little going on. There are some bars and some restaurants, bowling alley. Media generally has freedom of movement around the base in most of those, what I would call sort of public areas. We have to wear our press badge around our necks at all time so that people know that we're nearby and, to avoid us if they want to avoid us, which is what a lot of people do. So there's a bit of a scarlet letter thing that goes on. But it's otherwise, again, a very small town feel with not too much to do. So for like a week hearing, it's not too bad. I've had hearings that I've gone to for 4 weeks or 5 weeks, and then it gets a little bit repetitive in terms of, options of how to spend your time. Um, it really is an unusual court in a couple of other ways. One is it's very secure, so you go through multiple levels of security before you get in, and then um, you're not in a courtroom exactly. You're in a viewing gallery that is separated from the court by three panes of glass. And so, but you can watch what's happening in court in real time, but the audio and the visuals on monitors that are above the viewing gallery glass come into the gallery on a 40-second delay, which is to prevent any damage from spills of classified information. There's a lot of classified information in the case has a lot of closed sessions that are only attended by the prosecutors and the defense teams, not even the defendants, in which classified information is presented or argued. But there could be a spill in open court. And so there's 40 seconds for somebody to stand up and alert the court security officer to press a button that interrupts the feed, sends off a light, what we call the hockey light, and it kind of shuts down the court. Uh, so all that is really, it's kind of a disjointed viewing experience that makes it different than, any other court in which you see things really in real time. I should say that there is freedom of movement around the base with our press badges, but media cannot get photos or videos without having a public affairs officer from the Pentagon present with us. So that's a really big deal for broadcast media, which is why it's hard for lots of some types of journalists to go there and get anything useful because it's you can't get a lot of footage and imagery. It is very, and once you do it, it's reviewed for possible security violations. I will say from a writing journalist point of view, there are very little limits, basically none. The one I would say is that I think if you were, my interpretation of the rules that we sign, if you were to describe in detail, in written detail, certain security structures, I think they would have issue with that. But there's no, I've never been told not to. No one's attempted to tell me I can't write anything. So I think but it's really difficult for the people who go to get imagery of the base.
Yeah, that's great. And we will be taking questions now if anyone has any questions. I know, Terry, you made a statement. If anyone has any statements, please go ahead and talk to John. This is a collaborative effort.
Well, I just
Anybody have?
want to say, I'm here. I'm a victim family member. My sister was killed in the World Trade Center. John has been an incredible support to my organization, September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, which has since 2017 publicly supported pretrial agreements as the only way to get what we call judicial finality and judicial certainty, by which we mean verdicts that cannot be appealed, so that if these trials, pre-trials, continue forever, people don't die innocent. We know that, I know that the man who did the organizing that sent the plane into the North Tower, who has now been declared legally incompetent to stand trial, will die legally innocent. Um, that's because he was tortured. But I just wanted to also talk about what it's like as a victim family member to know that some of the most important decisions that are issued are the results of classified hearings. And we don't know what gets said. And then there's a judgment. And as John described, the classified hearings, no journalists, no, obviously, just not even the defendants. And it is really, it's just like looking at what should have been the most important trial being hidden from the public, from the victim family members, from the defendants in every meaningful way. I'll stop there. That wasn't a question. But, John, you've just been so amazing at communicating personally what it feels like as a journalist, really wanting to do a job that would serve the public.
Yeah,
Thank you.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say that that's really um, an important point that it's in addition to the classified hearings, and a lot of it involves the CIA program. Not all, but a lot of in some of the operations of the detention facility at Guantanamo, a lot of that is classified and off limits. But then a lot of the public sessions are opaque because they're trying to get some information in public where a lot of the meat of it is classified. So they have questions or refer to documents that the public can't see. So there's almost like three types of sessions where there's most of their, there's public sessions, there's classified sessions, and there's public sessions where it's pretty hard to figure out what's going on and what they're talking about, depending on the issue. And so that really was one of the motivations too for doing the book is that to like kind of piece it all together. And the case has unfolded in a very disjointed fashion, a little bit more linear with the suppression hearing I talked about whether the confessions are admissible in light of the CIA torture program. But it's even that's been kind of done out of order. And so the book is attempting to sort of, make as much sense of it as possible.
Thank you. Also, we have a question from Adam. He wanted to know, how did you get this beat?
Yeah, so the it actually it kind of opens the book, and I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, which is just that I went down really to profile a lawyer and to see him in action, and it was not intending to cover Guantanamo in any real sense. I wanted to write a really lengthy feature article about this lawyer defending KSN, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and sort of what it's like to represent the guy accused of planning 9/11. I thought that would be a really interesting article, but I just decided when I got there, I just decided I was so interested in kind of what was happening that I decided to stick with it. And I'm lucky because, again, it's this weird situation where you have the New York Times reporter, the New York Times putting a significant amount of effort into covering the military commissions in Guantanamo, and then other major outlets really doing it very intermittently, and then my publication. So it's unusual, and I could only do it to how did I get the beat? I mean, I sort of got the beat because I assigned myself to it, right? I mean, it's unusual. Even really great news organizations would say to a reporter, "You can't go. Not enough is going to happen this week. What's the story? What story are you going to get from some witness testifying who we have witness number 15 out of 30?" It's so much of the case is out of context now to the people who haven't been there that that you know being someone who goes regularly is what allows you to write about it. But so even really journalists and organizations I admire can't do it that much because they've got other stuff that their editors want them to do.
That's great. Thank you. Also, Jack has a question. He wants to know, how do you think in the duration of the time you spent on the case and what you've seen and heard has affected you from this first moment you sat in that court until now?
So, like, what's the most impactful on me in terms of what I've seen?
Yeah, like, what have you seen and heard that has affected you from the first moment you sat in that court until now? Like, how, basically how has that changed you too? Not only in your reporting, but on a personal level.
Yeah, I think it is a difficult case to cover because of the subject matter. I mean, part of it is the the details of the CIA program and sort of how those detainees were treated. That's some of that is really graphic and gruesome, but the flip side, of course, is that it's supposed to be about the 9/11 attacks, and our frustration is that there's not that much attention in court given to the 9/11 attacks. The prosecution does work hard to talk about it and sort of weave it into different arguments, but it's not done that regularly. When it is done, it's incredibly powerful. And I wrote about one of these instances in my book in which the prosecution wanted to take the testimony of victim family members who were sick and probably not going to make it to a trial. And sure enough, some of those people that he was arguing to get their testimony, at least in deposition form before a trial, have since died. And so one of the benefits of going, I should say there is a public viewing site for the media at Fort Meade in Maryland. But one of the benefits of going is that victim family members go to all the hearings, and interviewing them, talking with them sort of brings the the attack sort of into greater focus and sort of kind of why we're supposed to be there in the first place. And so talking with people like Terry, and then other people who, for example, oppose the plea deals. Terry's very in favor of plea deals. There are a lot of people who are opposed to them, and I think regardless of their position, I think talking to the victim family members have been sort of the most memorable part of it. And that whole phase when they were on the verge of pleading guilty and then the court let the government back away, you had one set of victim family members who were really upset and another who were really happy. And it was an incredibly emotional time.
Thank you. And Adam asks, how many inmates are at Gitmo right now? And have you had access to any of them directly?
So there are only 15 left. And they're most of the vast majority of the detainees were transferred out during Bush and then during Obama. So it really the population now is so dwindled. You don't have access to them. There's technically nothing stopping anyone from trying to contact a detainee who's been relocated to another country, which is what's happened to most of them. And actually, Carol Rosenberg from the Times has done some stories about that. I have not done that. I've kept my focus on what's happening in court, but you're not allowed to talk to the detainees, but you can talk. I mean, what's interesting is that you see them every day that you're in court and that they're in court. They don't have to go to court every day. They have to go to court on the first day where they're sort of reminded of their rights to either attend or not attend. And so, I've spent an incredible amount of time with those defendants, but through the glass. Um, but otherwise, you're limited to talking to their defense lawyers.
And what do you foresee the outcome being coming up in the next trial? And what are you doing to prepare?
Well, I think right now we're waiting for the judge to rule on the admissibility of the confessions made by the three defendants who tried to plead guilty and lost that, and now they're back in the case. So, the fourth defendant prevailed on that. He is now the government's appealing. It's getting confusing. The government's appealing his ruling, but he won his suppression ruling. Now the judge is going to rule on the other three. But it's complicated because they're those three defendants, in addition to saying, well, our confession should be suppressed, they're pursuing their right to plead guilty to the Supreme Court. So if the Supreme Court takes that that petition, then kind of all bets are off in terms of scheduling. We may have a situation where those three defendants are severed from the fourth defendant's case and it proceeds on a different track. And it's important. I said at the beginning there were five defendants who were charged in this case, and Terry touched on this earlier, but one of them, Ramzi Ben Al-Sheba, was severed from the case in 2023 because of a finding that he was mentally incompetent and unable to assist in the participation of his defense, which his lawyers blame on the CIA program for sort of torturing him into this endless state of misery. Um, so there's four defendants remaining. One is kind of really outside of the case for now. The government has the right to try to restore him to competency and still prosecute him, but that is an even more uncertain path than the case for the other four, which is still pretty uncertain. I don't know if there'll be a trial next year. That the government has asked the judge to set a trial date for about a year from now, and we just don't know how he's going to rule.
Thank you. And Terry did mention not a trial, but pre-trial hearing. So I did want to make that
Yeah.
clarification. And then we have another question from Mary, and she wants to know, how do you think your background in human rights impacted your interests and then your work with families and also your motivation to publish your book?
I think that I was prepared for covering Gitmo, even though I wasn't really going there initially to do that as like an 11-year project. I was prepared to do it because of my previous experience in covering justice mechanisms for war crimes and other human rights violations, which is what I've written articles on in different jurisdictions around the world, and that's what I did my master's in human rights studies on that topic specifically. So I wrote about a lot of new courts in doing that. And new courts, new justice mechanisms always face huge challenges at the outset as they try to get going. So the sort of craziness that has engulfed the Guantanamo court was something I was a little bit prepared for. So I think that it really was. Um, a really big part of me going to Gitmo, sort of seeing what was unfolding and not being intimidated by it too much, by thinking that if I just spent enough time kind of looking at things, that it would start to make sense to me.
And of the remaining inmates there, is there one that you would like to particularly speak with? And if so, what would you ask them?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think that I think most people um Khalid Sheikh Mohammed he's accused of being the mastermind of 9/11, of really orchestrating the operation. I think talking to him would be something that any journalist would want to do. There's another detainee who's not been charged. His name is Abu Zubaydah, and um, he was the first that we know of, I think, detainee captured and put into CIA custody in 2002. And so they tested the torture techniques on him. He was sort of like the guinea pig for what they used on all the other detainees. And he's not even been seen in court because they don't have evidence to charge him. So they're not going to release him, it doesn't seem. I can't imagine they ever would. But they're not going to charge him. But his experience through that would obviously be, again, any journalist would love to have that interview.
Absolutely. And if there's, some key takeaways that you would want from everyone who's attending here, especially amongst journalists, what are some of the insightful, advice that you would give to them?
Well, it's now is not a bad time to try to cover the case, I think, because you know there's a lot that's already. I mean, essentially, I could say you can use my book to sort of catch up, and then everything will make sense. But I think the case is now in a, the suppression litigation is seems to be potentially concluding. And then the case is getting to get into a next phase, maybe, which is the kind of final motions. There's going to be other evidentiary motions. The government has other evidence that the defense teams are going to want to have suppressed, but those will move faster than the suppression due to the torture. So if those move forward and then there's a trial set next year, I think it's a pretty good time to go. And I can certainly give any journalist the information of who to contact at the Pentagon to express interest. And if you can't get to Gitmo, because it is a bit of a commitment, you have to fly down on a Saturday. The flight is $800. You have to fly down on a Saturday, and then you can't leave until the next Saturday at least. You can always leave after a week, but then there's quite often travel issues because of the remoteness of the base and the weather. And so, you can be gone for a long period of time, and there may not be something like that interesting that happens. That happens a lot, especially for journalists who aren't doing what I'm doing, which is really kind of in the weeds, reporting on what's happening in court. But people who want to get a bigger takeaway, it's not always the best investment. So you can always go to Fort Meade, Maryland, to sort of at least see the court in action. But then if you can make it work, there's really nothing beats going there and experiencing it for yourself, because you'll have a greater understanding of why it's taken so long. It's really a huge operation to get, if you thought to yourself, if you had like a 10 defendant mafia case in New York and you said, let's get everybody involved to a Caribbean island, right? It'd be really hard. And that's essentially what happens um, every time that there's a hearing. So when you go through it yourself, I think you really get an appreciation for the logistical challenges involved, which are really inseparable from the legal challenges, because it impacts every phase of the proceedings.
That's great. And we do have Jack who wants to ask you a question. Go ahead, Jack. You have the floor.
Hi, John. I just want to pick your brain a bit more on the change from when I was landed there, not necessarily just with you, but the energy in the room and how it affected the defense and the prosecution, kind of everyone involved, and really the people that are like, what was the thing that you saw that was most shocking for the change that sense, and yeah.
That just cut up a little bit for me. I don't know.
Jack, just ask again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. It cut up a little bit.
At the end. But that's a great
Sorry,
question.
it might be because I'm in the United Kingdom. Maybe is why the signal's so bad. But no, it's more of a question of in the time there, and with you, kind of on my question earlier, but also with the other people there, with the prosecution, with the defense, with the court, and everyone involved. Change was like, and what you saw over time. Like
Oh,
and you sat down for the first time, and then from the what did you see and how did people change? In all ways. It doesn't have to be one way, but how did you from when you started to now, how did you change? How did the defense and the prosecution, what did you see a lot with those?
yeah. Well, I think get more the gist of it now. One huge difference is that people have really aged a lot, right? So the defendants look much different now than they did when I started covering it. Their beards are gray, except KSM, Khalid Mohammed, he dyes his beard orange. But people are graying, they're frailer, and I think that's one big difference. This security posture of the court's different. When I first started going, the defendants were marched in with guards on either side and with them holding onto their arms and then sat down. Now, like the defendants sort of come and go with a guard trailing, slowly behind, and it's become more relaxed in that sense. I think it just seemed like around the time they started pleading guilty and after that, it eased up a little bit. But I think the age of the defendants is one big thing, and then the change of the lawyers involved, right? Like that's another huge problem for the case is that the teams are not the same. The chief prosecutor who I met in 2015, who was going to be the person to like march this to trial, a brigadier general in the Army, Mark Martins, um, he left the case. And so it's the personalities change and it makes the continuity, I think, is another factor in what can slow the case down. Um, that's happened a few times where one of the lead defense lawyers has had to leave and it really slows the case down a lot. And that could happen. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit off topic, but that's something that could happen next year, for example, if we're moving towards trial and one of the lead lawyers, because the defendants are entitled to have a capitally trained, like a death penalty lawyer represent them. If one of those people steps away, it could really slow down the proceedings. So, but yeah, so I would say um, the age of defendants is the thing that sticks out the most for me.
We have another question from Adam. He said, how has covering these cases differed from covering federal court cases stateside? And what has been the biggest challenge?
Um, yeah, it's almost unrelated from my time being a federal court reporter. When I covered federal courts, you could come and go from courts all the time, right? You would like walk into a courtroom, see part of a hearing, and then leave, and you had total freedom of movement. And here we're sort of, it's very secure, and you can't sort of leave and go to the bathroom without having someone, one of your minders, like follow you and watch you at all times. The other thing, the way that the court makes its documents public is sort of a pro and a con. So the pleadings and the transcripts are all freely available on the Military Commission's website, and they can be up there relatively timely. The transcripts, especially once in a while, go up in a timely manner, but so much of the case has sensitive or classified information that the pleadings take a really long time to get up. So there's almost no way to prepare for certain hearings because none of the documents are yet public. And then you might say to yourself, "Oh, I'd like to go back and read that transcript." Like I missed a week recently. I'd love to read the transcripts. I can't do that because they're not available. And sometimes, even though even though the session was public, it gets such a security review that they redact information from the public transcript. But that process alone just takes it so long to get to the website. So that gets into this idea, is it really a public proceeding? So a lot of people make it like work hard to try to get it to be a public proceeding, but there are a lot of impediments and it kind of relates to the volume of information that the government has concerns over. So that really is probably, one of the biggest differences with a regular court.
Ted has a really good question, and I want him to ask it in person at the end of this. But we do have a question from Shannon, and they ask, given what little you know about what goes on in closed hearings, is there one question or topic that nags you the most?
Yeah, first of all, that's a really good question because I should say that what the court does is that it will release transcripts of those closed hearings with classified information blacked out. So you might get a transcript that they post online from the closed session that is entirely blacked out, except for maybe somebody's like a defense attorney's name or something like that, but it's completely blacked out. Other times it will have really interesting information that is made available, but it's not technically classified. So if you spend the time going through those transcripts, which I did for my book, you can find some really, really interesting information. I think one of the things that I would like to know is that, and this might be a little bit in the weeds for some of you, but there's when the Senate did its report on the CIA program, which came out in 2014, it contained a line that the CIA had operational control of the detention facility where the high value, where the former CIA detainees were held. So it was this idea that the CIA had some control over what happened on Guantanamo, where these people were being held, and that would seem to cut into the government's contention that there's a big separation between what happened at the black sites and what happened in Guantanamo Bay. But all of that information, all those hearings now that have been related to that, and they've had the former commander of the detention facility at the time testify about that. And he testified that even though the guards there wore military uniforms, they were not actually members of the military. So there's this idea of what role did the CIA have on Guantanamo Bay, that the vast majority of that has been completely off limits to the public, that I think would be incredibly interesting.
That's great. Ted, do you mind asking your question in person, please?
Hi, thanks for doing this, John. I asked sort of an umbrella question, but I misattributed to Ms. Rockefeller. I apologize. The victim family members for Peaceful Tomorrow testified in front of Senate Judiciary in December 2021. And their testimony was that the commissions have failed. I ask you as a objective journalist and court watcher, if there's another assessment or conclusion that you've arrived at in your time covering Guantanamo.
Yeah, in my report, if you go to lawdragon.com/Guantanamo, my stories are very, I think, objective and very detailed. And there's really no trace, I hope. I mean, there always is, I guess, but no trace of really my opinion or biases in my reporting. In the book, I do take more, which is natural in either like a long feature story or a book, to sort of take more of a open perspective. I mean, they clearly haven't worked, I think, but the question I ask is that, is it possible that the process has worked, right? I've talked about this tension of a country that would create this rendition program, and then the country that would try to, have a trial for these people. And it's played out in a way that has dragged on for this long, but maybe the process of that dragging out for so long is the system working, right? Other countries might have just executed these people or held them, in complete secrecy. I think that would have been really hard. I mean, they were held in secrecy for so long. I think that wouldn't have been able, they wouldn't have been able to maintain that, but they could have just kept them as hidden as possible. Who knows? But they've tried to have these trials, and so I've wondered if the fact that, keep in mind that the government, it pays for the prosecution, but it pays for all the defense lawyers. They've got defense teams of 5, 7 lawyers and 20 staff members in total. Sometimes staffing kind of varies, but the government would pay all this money to get them some of the most renowned lawyers in the country. That is really interesting. So I wonder, is that a version of something working, even if the end result is not a completed trial?
That's great. Does anyone else have any other questions that they want to ask? John, is there anything else that you want to say before we end this call? I just wanted to thank you again for your time. This has been wonderful and very valuable, and I appreciate your insight.
No, nothing for me. I really, again, thank the SPJ for doing this and for everybody for showing up. And definitely happy to. My email is just john@lawdragon.com. That's my company name, john@lawdragon.com. So please email me with any questions or thoughts or advice on how to try to get to Gitmo or anything like that. I'm happy to help.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.